everyone. Welcome to our first panel of Brown China Summit 2023, entitled Navigating Cross-Cultural Success, the Rise of Foreign Business in China and Chinese Businesses Abroad. My name is Autumn, and I'm the co-president of Brown China Summit, and I will be moderating this event. So first, let us start by introducing our panelists here. So we first have Tom Doctoroff. He's a renowned business leader and global brand builder. He's also one of the world's foremost experts on Chinese consumer behaviors and the Asian commercial landscape. Between 2012 to 2016, Tom was the CEO of J. Water Thompson Asia Pacific, one of the region's fast-growing and most profitable marketing and communication companies. And Tom is also the author of many books, including What Chinese Want. And next we have Claire. Claire is the Vice President of American Chamber of Commerce in China, based in Beijing. She oversees government affairs, policy, industry groups, cooperative programs, and signature events at AmCham China. And last but not least, we have Charles. Charles is a senior fellow at Taihe Institute, member of the Strategy Committee of China Academy, chairman of the Investment Committee of Leading Tech Technologies, co-founder of How Capital, funding partner of Impact Asia Innovation Technology Fund, senior researcher at the Chinese Academy of Environmental Sciences. We're so excited to have you all on board today to discuss the challenges and opportunities for foreign businesses operating in China and Chinese businesses going abroad. So now let us start by throwing the first question to our panelists. So what motivated you all to work with cross-cultural businesses, and how have you seen the trend of cross-cultural businesses grow over the past decade? And if anybody want to start with this question, that'd be great.
I mean, what motivated me was I was working in advertising, which, you know, in the 90s, and which is really the intersection of commerce and culture, in my opinion, because you really have to dig deep and understand the fundamental motivations of consumers that explain behavior and preference. And then just by chance, I was offered the opportunity to go to Hong Kong and China to lead some of our operations there. And I planned on that being a 2-year trip, but then it turned into 25 years. So I became very enthralled by being able to look at the humanity across different cultures, and of course, including China, and really became fascinated by the fundamentally different worldviews of the Chinese and the Western populations, and how that can affect business strategy and communication strategy.
For me,
go ahead.
Okay. For me, I was born in Taiwan, but educated in the States. So it was cross-cultural to start with. And then I had 15 years at the United Nations. That's multi-cross-cultural, negotiating economic issues and social issues in the United Nations. So coming to China in 1990, now I've been here for 32 years. It was just an opportunity. It was an investment bank that wanted to set up an office and offer me the position of opening the office for them in Beijing. And I thought it would be quite exciting. I thought it would be really interesting. And China was forecasted to boom even at that time. So for someone who is somewhat of a younger man, obviously it was opportunistic as well to participate in the growth of China. Seemed like a very exciting prospect. That's why I came.
For me, when I was in college, I actually studied international communication, but when I started working, I worked for the Chinese government. So after several years, I realized that I needed to be in a more internationalized environment so that I can really increase my understanding and appreciation of diverse cultures, ways of thinking, different perspectives, etc., so that our communication could be more effective. So that's why I decided to do my master's degree in the States and then start working for multinational companies. That's how I came into this cross-cultural business environment.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. We do have panelists from a diverse background. And now the second question would be, since you all mentioned a little bit, so what are some of the biggest challenges for businesses facing when operating in cross-cultural environments? And how can these challenges be effectively navigated? Yeah, if somebody would like to start off.
Well, I'll start off sort of in the sky here. And I'm speaking now of Western companies operating in China. You know, there have been many, many mistakes made by Western companies because they have made an erroneous conclusion that, and this is, you know, going back several decades, but I still think it sort of happens today, that there is no fundamental cultural difference or aspiration between Chinese individuals and young people. Excuse me, Chinese individuals and Western individuals. You know, I like to say that Western society is an individualistic society. And that means that despite a lot of conformity that does exist, you know, in the West and in America, society encourages individuals to define themselves independent of society, where that is not true in China, which is profoundly a Confucian society with different cultural worldviews, where the basic building block of society is the clan. And that results in many different business imperatives. What people are willing to pay a high price for, what people are not willing to pay a high price for, how you reassure consumers in a environment that is seen to be less safe than in the United States. And I think that once Western companies understand that they're not in Kansas anymore, they can begin to shift their, not only their marketing position, but their product offering, their retail distribution, channels, everything to become aligned with the Chinese worldview.
I have 3 points on this. The first point is, of course, as Tom described, the cultural basis is different. But I would add that cultural, social, and historical, philosophical basis is all different. But that difference has actually been reduced significantly in the last 30 years. Watching how China developed over the last 30-some years, I noticed there's been a tremendous effort by the young Chinese to learn about the Western ways. Of course, that's not reciprocated. You don't have Westerners enthusiastically embracing the learning of Chinese culture and the Chinese language. But I think the younger population in China today are probably a lot more sophisticated about what's happening in the West than the West is about China. That's one difference. The second thing, which is significant in terms of this cultural difference, is I think it, in the business side, is really, really different going from sector to sector. For example, you're in the advertising business, in marketing and so on and so forth. It's a very different sector than, let's say, the automobile sector or the high electronics sector and so on. I've made many investments in different companies in China, and I find that in some aspects, the cultural differences are significant, but when the German engineer and the Shanghai engineer get together, boy, can they talk up a storm. There doesn't seem to be any cultural differences there. Then the third part, which is really, I think, the most significant today, is no longer cultural differences, but we're facing very, very strict or very difficult geopolitical issues. Now, to talk about business in China today, either China outbound or Western companies inbound, without considering geopolitics, you're committing suicide. I think this is really, really very frightening how it's going down the road. I hope it gets better. I hope with the opening up after COVID, things get better. But so far, the last couple of years, especially last year, I've seen just a downward trend.
Yeah.
And sorry, excuse me, Claire. And if we have,
No, go ahead.
you know, if we have a chance to respond to each other, that would be fun. But Claire, go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, you go ahead. You are gonna respond to what Charles just mentioned. I can go after you responded to him.
No, I just want to say that there's a slight disagreement here in, yes, people are becoming more familiar with each other. And I totally agree with Charles that the Chinese know much more about America and the West than the West knows about America. But I still believe that ultimately, when it comes to the individual's relationship to society, China remains on its own cultural orbit. And what looks very similar, like, for example, how people use the internet, how people use social media, the actual nuances of what people are looking for stay the same. Like, there's one golden rule that I would have in building businesses in China, and that is that Chinese consumers are willing to pay a significant price premium for any goods that are consumed outside of the home. So that explains why luxury has a very distinct role in China relative to the West in terms of the penetration amongst the youth in China, because of the importance of public consumption and building social capital. Now, this is evolving in terms of its expression, but it is still very much true. It explains why Haagen-Dazs's business model is fundamentally different, in China, public consumption in stores versus private consumption in the West. It explains why Starbucks has changed its business model to make their stores bigger and a site of new generation affiliation in China, and charge a higher price of coffee in China than they do in the United States. But it also explains why, for the most part, and this is evolving, but for the most part, goods that are consumed in-home are extremely competitive in terms of price. This public versus private consumption dichotomy still exists because of the role of social capital and the role of the need for external acknowledgement in a non-individualistic society. And the youth are becoming more internationalized. I don't want to say westernized, but still, I think that fundamental cultural difference remains the same. I mean, it's evolving in its expression, but it remains the same. That's my humble point of view.
Thanks, Tom and Charles, for sharing your perspectives. I think we all agree that there are a lot of challenges when a business is operating in China. It can range from language barrier, miscommunication, different values in norms and beliefs. There are also ethical dilemmas and conflicts, etc. And as you guys just mentioned, business will always have to adapt to local consumer preferences and behaviors, etc. So too many challenges, I don't want to repeat any of them. But I think the second part of the question was about, how can these challenges be effectively navigated? So looking at some of the AmCham's member companies in China, I think there are some good practices that I want to share with the audience. First of all, they obviously need to adapt the business practice and strategies to suit local conditions and customers, like what Tom just mentioned. These top consumer brands in China, their strategies are very different from where they are in the United States. For many of the manufacturings, for example, when they have factories in different areas, they all have to build very strong relationships and partnerships with the local stakeholders, especially with the communities. Especially nowadays, ESG, sustainability, etc., have become very hot topics in order to build a better ecosystem for the companies to be in a better position to compete both locally and globally. They have to look at what they can do to contribute to the local community. So that's just to name a couple of seemingly effective ways to overcome these challenges. I'm pretty sure that Charles and Tom might have other suggestions regarding how to address these challenges faced by the companies in China.
Yeah, anyone want to add on to that? or we can move on to the next question.
Well, I'd just like to say something about the importance of pricing strategy. And pricing to me is where most of the Western companies tend to fall on the most concrete level. And I think that regardless of whether it's automobiles, whether it's luxury products, the pricing structure needs to be shifted. So for example, if we take a look at luxury goods, the way that luxury became big in China was by targeting the Chinese youth, not just the Chinese elite. And so what that had to require, this is just one, sector, to Charles' point that strategies have to be different depending on sector, is that they went heavy towards accessorization. So most young Chinese women, for example, could never afford a LV bag, but what they could afford is an accessory, an LV mobile phone holder, for example. That's why when you go into a luxury store today, much of the volume and even the merchandising is based on accessorization. And that's why the sub-branding strategy, really in China is very different, where you have a series of sub-brands to help people climb up the ladder of the luxury brand until it reaches the pinnacle with the most social currency value. So pricing really always needs to be considered in terms of what people are willing to pay for, from cars to a can of Pepsi.
Yep. Thank you for sharing. We do hear a lot of answers from different viewpoints. Just echo what Tom, you were saying, pricing strategy is very important. And considering private versus public consumption of goods is also a crucial aspect when expanding businesses in China. So the next question is directed to you, but other speakers are welcome to jump in and then discuss and share your viewpoints as well. So my next question would be, how have you seen the advertising strategies evolving to better cater to different cultures? And Tom, as you're someone who has been working in advertising industry for over 20 years. So what's your viewpoint on this? And can you share us with some successful campaigns regarding this? Thank you.
Can you repeat the question specifically again, please?
Yes. So how have you seen the advertising strategies evolve to better cater different cultures? And can you share us with some successful examples of different campaigns and that are tailored to the specific cultural context?
So, for example, one example of advertising that has been significantly adjusted, but still maintaining its roots. And this is a little bit old, and I can go more recent if you want, but it illustrates some points elegantly. Is diamonds, De Beers diamonds back in the 90s and the 2000s. I don't know whether any of your audience has ever heard the tagline. Now it's the forever mark, because De Beers strategy has totally changed to the forever mark, but it's a diamond is forever. All right. And in China, the West, what that always meant was a diamond lasts forever, romantic love lasts forever, and every advertising campaign was a celebration of that eternal mutual romantic commitment, and it would be extremely passionate. All right. But in China, when we say a diamond is forever, what we mean is commitment, 承诺, that lasts a lifetime, because the role of marriage and the role of romantic love is very different in China than it is in the West. In China, it's two families coming together, in a relatively dangerous, institutionally weak environment. And so as a result, that 承诺 is what is fundamental for a diamond to represent. So societal issues come into a diamond ad much more so than it does in the West. Now, does that mean that Chinese people don't want romance and they don't want romantic love? Of course not. But it has to be balanced and integrated in a different way. And there's several examples where the role of the individual, and the role of individualism is not as prominent. You take Nike, just do it. Just do it means something very different in the West than it does in China. Just do it in China is not about you're liberating your own self, and liberating your own self, and inside everybody is the potential to just realize his own true being. It really is just do it, an encouragement to move forward step by step so that you ultimately can become a champion acknowledged by other people. So at the end of every Nike ad, even today, you see either explicitly or implicitly the applause of the crowd, encouraging the success that is, again, recognized by other people. And Nike has always had actually a little bit of a challenge adapting its brand into China because of its undying faith in Western individualism, where you have local brands like AmCham that really understand the role of sports at different levels of society, especially within the mass market. So AmCham has recognized, the weaknesses of Adidas and Nike, and carved out its own bond with the Chinese consumer based on a desire to use sports in a way that can generate social currency. Yongbu Jibu, that's the ANTA tagline. Yongbu Jibu really means taking one step at a time to move forward.
And any other speakers want to add on to that or share some examples or thoughts?
I would just like to add something on to what Tom described. He takes the concrete situation now and analyzes it perfectly. He knows his business. What I find that is really significant, having spent 30 years in Beijing, 32 years now in China, is how rapidly things change. 30 some years ago, some brands were really big name. LV became big in late 90s, 2000s, and so on. And then it became Hermes and others. So there's a shift. And in terms of that shift, what is most significant, I find in young people today, is that branding is no longer as significant as it used to be 20 years ago. Also, there's much more confidence in their domestic production or what is produced in China, Chinese brands. There's more confidence overall about their country, about their society, about their position in the world. These are all sort of coming together into somewhat one might call nationalistic approach, but I find that more and more among young people today in China. There's a stronger sense of self-confidence. So the branding that was used, let's say, that I saw from 30 years ago, may not be as applicable as they are today, I think.
Well, I agree with you 100%, Charles. Things have changed dramatically. The role of online platforms, the role of how people, generate their identities through engagement with these platforms, the role of community, what the actual definition of societal acknowledgement means has shifted dramatically from a broader acknowledgement to acknowledgement by the tribe or the sub-tribes amongst Chinese youth that means something to me. This has changed dramatically. I also agree with you that people are developing much more confidence in the functional values of local brands. And there is tremendous nationalism now that didn't exist explicitly, back a decade ago, or even, 7 years ago. But I would also say that everything is always gray, all right? There's no black and white here. So I still have not seen, for example, a local brand that has scale that also charges a price premium versus an international competitor. Now, I may be wrong about that, and some example may have come up that I'm not familiar with because China is a massive landscape. But ultimately, what people are willing to pay a price premium for is still rooted in trends that existed for several decades when I first came to China in 1994 and are still true today, even in 2023. So things shift, but there's no big bang of change in my view.
You're right, but I can cite a couple of examples. These are things that I've encountered myself in the last couple of years. Were it not for the sanctions against Huawei's phones in China, especially the flip phone, would be phenomenal seller in China. The demand was so huge, there was a long wait for it until the US sanctions came. No more 5G chips. They couldn't produce it anymore. Another one that's coming up, electric vehicles, like Weilai and Lixiang are doing phenomenally well, and they're beating out even Tesla in a number of instances. So I'm not saying that this will be inevitable, but I see the self-confidence. But the self-confidence is fact-based because they were able to produce the Mate 2X by Huawei, which was considered the best phone in the world. And then the other part that we should see is, as you said, how the channels of sales have changed. The internet selling, just incredible what goes on. How quickly overnight, 100 million, 200 million, 300 million in sales by the influencers. So these are new things which is not yet tested in the West in a big way. We'll see. But things are just happening so quickly in terms of changes compared to, let's say, 7 years ago.
I agree. And I mean, in just the usage of digital platforms, you know, online to offline, it's significantly more advanced in China than it is in the United States. How it's penetrated retail, it's much further along. You know, we have no equivalent to what WeChat is as a multi-purpose, you know, app that can manage all aspects, many aspects of life. The only thing that I would like to, maybe I'm just a little bit more conservative than Charles in terms of what change actually means at a deeper psychological level is I remember, you know, just a couple of years ago when we were, you know, marketing Apple phones, you know, in China, and we had to, of course, look at, you know, what was happening with Huawei. Yes, Huawei has its premium phones, all right, but then in order to separate it from its mainstream phones, it needed to develop a sub-brand. And even that sub-brand, you know, which was not
Honor. Yes.
Yeah, Honor, exactly, you know, didn't have the same price as an Apple or even a Samsung, all right? So I do think that local brands are not as trusted to deliver the social capital. I'm not saying that things can't evolve further in the future, especially given, you know, Chinese nationalism, but I still think that that's swimming up against a tide.
Yeah, and Claire, do you want to add anything onto this specific?
Just one piece of comment to echo what Charles just mentioned. I have a teenage boy, and it's clear to me that although he can actually, from his own pocket money, he can afford some international brands, for example, shoes, but among him and his friends, with the rise of the nationalism, they prefer to buy some local brands. So I actually have a question for Tom. I'm not sure with this rise of nationalism in consumer brands, what changes have you seen in terms of the advertising strategies from international brands in China? Are they already doing something to compete with the local brands, which are cheaper? Actually, the quality is not that bad compared to some years ago. Or they are, you know, are they doing anything to deal with that?
I don't think that there's anything that international brands can do specifically to become patriotic brands, right? And what most of the brands are doing is they're using, surrogates for national pride, in terms of their usage of celebrities, for example, or how they are adopting the technologies and the platforms, that young Chinese people on a digitally speaking, think are important for their own sense of identity and their own expression. But I think that most international brands know that they can't compete directly on a nationalistic level, and to be very fair, this rise of to be transparent, this rise of, hardcore nationalism is something that is very recent. I'm talking hardcore nationalism. And I think that what's happened in China is during the COVID period, in the recent years of Xi Jinping, many of the multinational brands, have shifted resources away from China to a certain extent. So there's not a lot of really well thought out, how do we confront the nationalism, that is rising. It's a beast, in the eyes of most multinational companies, and there's no really well thought strategy. But the key point is that you avoid offending Chinese people, and there's a tremendous amount of conservatism. So, for example, when Marriott a few years ago made a mistake by talking about Taiwan as a country on its website, there was, of course, a huge rebellion across all of China, and it immediately just simply made an apology to the Chinese people for hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. So right now, I think amongst Western companies, there's a fear of poking the dragon and offending the sensibilities of Chinese people. It's made it a much less friendly environment to develop brand.
Tom, you mentioned that this really came about 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Yeah, right.
Think about the timing. It was just at the beginning of the trade war launched by President Trump.
Yeah.
And it was so negative and China bashing that the public in China really felt very, very disgusted.
Yeah.
So I think the reaction, the nationalism response is in reaction to China bashing that started with the trade war. And that still has not been resolved yet, the trade war.
Nope. The trade war hasn't been responded, and I don't want to get into the political realm right now, but let's just say that the marketing environment is very much influenced by the breakdown in communications between two governments and lack of mutual understanding. That has not gotten better at all. And I think that both sides, and I'm not going to put weights on them, share responsibility in what's happening right now. But it does affect, in the marketing world, a rise of angry nationalism, which, is something that is a relatively new phenomenon.
Just to going off of what Tom, you just mentioned, COVID certainly has a real negative impact on multinational companies' operations, especially in China. And my next question is towards that as well. So according to the Chinese Business Climate Service report by AmCham China, in 2022, the member companies faced unprecedented challenges: the economic slowdown, the epidemic control, and the addition of the new compliance requirements in China and the United States. And now we're seeing those COVID policies are being lifted, and China, in terms of business world, is more connected to the rest of the world. So Claire, you're the Vice President of AmCham China. Can you start us off with what would you predict that will happen given that the COVID policies is lifted, and especially for multinationals operation in China? Thank you.
Sure. In fact, yes, it was true that about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we launched our 2022 Business Climate Survey in Beijing. And if we look at the data we collected from our member companies, the numbers actually don't look very good, not very optimistic. Because for the first time in the survey's 25 years history, members are less willing to invest in China, with fewer than 50% listing China as a top 3 destination for investment. There were some key reasons to this new trend. One is the uncertainty around China's policy environment. Second is the expectation of much slower economic growth. in China. Third is overall the uncertainty in the US-China economic relationship. At the beginning, I think Charles mentioned the geopolitical the situation affected business decisions or continued investment in China a lot. This is pretty much in line with the survey results we have. Even with the COVID-19 restrictions lifted, we do see more proactive attitudes from the central governments of China approaching the business communities, trying to help the business community to stay in China, to even continue or expand their investment, but it takes time. And also another challenge, the China teams of multinational companies here have been having hard times trying to communicate with their headquarters in terms of why they should still stay in China or even expand their business in China. Because with the travel restrictions in the past 3 years, normally for global CEOs who are having 3 to 4 years terms at their positions, they didn't get chance to come to see China and business environment for themselves. So it's very challenging for the local teams to convince their headquarters, unless China is playing a significant role in terms of revenue contribution to the global operation. Otherwise, people are very doubtful about the uncertainty, the intransparency, and the inconsistency of related regulations here in China. So to answer your question, most members, although in our data we see that 74% of our member companies are saying they are not currently considering leaving China market, but doesn't mean that they will keep staying here as is right now, or they're not. It doesn't mean they're not considering other countries, especially those countries in Southeast Asia, as their the backup plan, especially for supply chain management.
Thank you, Claire. Any other thoughts on this, Tom and Charles?
Charles?
I think one of the things that Claire described was perfect. The last 3 years have been very, very difficult. I have many friends from Europe and the United States who, for the last 6 months, have been sitting on their suitcases waiting for China to open and visas to be issued. When you have mainstream press talking negatively about China on a continuous basis, it's very difficult to make judgments unless you see it for your own eyes. You come. And now it's opened up and I see booming traffic. In fact, from Germany now, it's, I think starting this week, this coming week, it'll be daily flights to Beijing again from Lufthansa and daily flights to Shanghai as well. So I hope all of this will improve the situation. But ultimately, I'm still very concerned about the geopolitics, because for those who are doing business in China, who are embracing the Chinese market, who thinks the Chinese market will continue to have greater growth than the rest of the world, at least this year, are not so enthusiastic in wanting to project this is their position, because this may not be politically correct in their own countries, including some European countries.
Yeah, it's very true, Charles, because when we had our communications with member companies, when they talk about their headquarters, even for the ones who are willing to travel to see China in the near future, like next week, the Chinese government is going to have a China Development Forum. Yes. Many global company CEOs are coming to join this forum, but at the same time, they actually are facing pressure from Washington, D.C. back in the, in the States. So they actually, it's not only about challenges here, it's also about challenges in their headquarters. So
the only thing that I'd like to add is from a personal perspective, I lived full-time in China until 2016, and then I traveled there about once a month between 2016 and just before the beginning of COVID. And I noticed just a change in the vibe of how I, as a foreigner, was received. And I found it to be increasingly, I don't want to say hostile, but less friendly. I mean, one of the great things about Chinese folks are that when they're feeling confident, they reach out to the world, they embrace new knowledge. But when they're not feeling confident, they tend to become a little bit more or quite a bit more self-protective. And sometimes that is defensive. They can build walls. You know, I mean, I think that the master psychological tension between within Chinese people is a Confucian tension. It's a desire to project and to be ambitious versus a self-protection and regimentation tension or impulse. And now I think very much for a variety of factors due to economic uncertainty, growth rates lowering, the geopolitical environment, you know, the actual infractions of the West and the offenses that they have committed towards China, their own leadership, which is, encouraging a wolf warrior diplomacy, that right now Chinese are very self-protective. And I think that from a personal standpoint and from a wanting to go live in China standpoint, it's a less attractive destination for business leaders and even for mid-level staff. And I don't see that changing for quite some time. I no longer, now this is not only because of COVID, but of course, greatly exacerbated by COVID. I no longer have any of my friends who used to live in China for decades. They're all gone, and the question is bringing them back is going to be quite a challenge given the new environment. So I think that this interchange of cultures that happened so beautifully in China within the German organizations, within, the car companies and every, other type of organization isn't happening as naturally as it used to happen. So there are barriers and there's a breakdown in understanding.
Yeah, that's so true regarding the unwillingness of, for example, American employees to relocate to China. We saw a big change in the past few years. Not many, I probably should say very few employees from the US headquarters are willing to move to China right now. It's not only because of the COVID-19 situation, it's also about the overall economic situation here. That's another challenge the HR people are facing right now in the Chinese market, especially for the ones that, for example, Apple, they wanted to get their US engineers to move to China to help with R&D, etc. But they've been having hard times trying to get those people to relocate to this market. So that's another big challenge that these companies are facing right now.
Yep, thank you for sharing. And I do have a whole list of questions, but I do want to turn the chances to our audience. So now we're taking audience Q&A. So Barry, if you want to start us off with the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Charles. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yes.
So I think one of the three things that I really took away from the conversation was culture change and consumerism. So looking just in the past few years, I think there definitely is this embracing of perhaps a more individualistic or more Western philosophy within the Chinese population, but there's also an increasing schism just given the geopolitical reality. So I guess the question is really the million-dollar crystal ball question, which is what are some of the risks and opportunities that we're seeing given how different and similar perhaps we are becoming as some of the things that have been changing, especially after COVID, culturally when it comes to consumer behaviors or just in general.
So what's the crystal ball question again?
So like the future, what does the future hold in terms of differences or similarities, just given what's been happening in such a dynamic sort of last 2 years?
Well, I'm just gonna challenge a little bit your word schism, and this goes back, I think, to a little mini debate that Charles and I were sort of having. I don't believe that there is a schism between Western orientation and non-Western, or local pride or nationalism. I think that there has always been, right, Western individualism as an aspiration, but it is a dangerous aspiration. I always called Western individualism or Western behavior, if you even want to broaden it, as Eve's apple. All right. It's tempting, it's juicy, but if you bite into it, you get banished to the land of the outcasts. So Western companies need to play with that aspiration, and that aspiration expresses itself differently for different 5-year generations of Chinese people, but you never actually go to become Western, and I think that for the future, success is going to be ultimately about navigating that tension between, as I mentioned earlier, projection of status and ambition on one hand and self-protection on the other, wrapped in, individual self-actualization. But what Chinese self-actualization is very different than Western self-actualization. So I think that really it's going to be about how you leverage the timeless marketing principles of China in a very new context. Chinese nationalism is not something new. Chinese nationalism has come up before and it will come up again. It's a cyclical thing. It's a shifting, and I don't want to use this, crudely, but from yin to yang. So really the question is, where is the pendulum, and how does the positioning of brands and what categories are invested in shift a little bit according to where that pendulum is? But it's not a schizophrenia. It's not a break.
Anyone want to add on to that? If not,
I could just add one perspective, if I may. I think it's no longer the Chinese market as we describe it as the Chinese market, because the Chinese market in terms of supply chain is actually the Chinese market, including the ASEAN countries, maybe even includes Korea and Japan. It is a complete supply chain, which is much, much bigger base than before. And now, given what's happening with the Middle East and the stance, it's becoming even a bigger market as well as the supply chain. It's really quite interesting what's occurred in recent years. I think the Chinese market, as we see it, there's an effort by the government to increase domestic consumption in case there are problems in the export side, including potential more serious conflict with the United States. But increasing domestic consumption will probably mean domestic brands. Domestic consumption of domestic brands will be promoted. So I think many Chinese brands are now becoming quite good sellers in South America and in the Middle East as well, and also in terms of the ASEAN countries. The electric two-wheelers, the three-wheelers that the Chinese make now is selling up a storm in the Philippines and in Vietnam and Malaysia, and it's now headed to Pakistan and the Middle East as well. So I think it's really a greater Asian market that is more than the Chinese-US schism or break. So I think one has to look at it on a more regional basis than before.
And
Talking about opportunities within the Chinese market, we probably want to look at the opportunities from sector to sector. Although there's not much optimism in such sectors as ICT, but from our data, we do see that there might be something that businesses can do in the areas of agriculture, and healthcare. Because if you look at the bilateral trade value between the two countries, last year actually it still went up quite a lot. And in the healthcare sector, although it's a heavily regulated area for companies, but still, if you look at the advancement of the technologies in the healthcare sector, the international companies, especially the ones from the United States, are still in a much higher, top leading position. So they still have quite a strong and competitive advantage in the market. So yeah, that's if you look at from the business opportunities within China, that's two sectors I would think of.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking to both what Claire and Charles said, in terms of, domestic brands, and the appeal of domestic brands, there is no question that domestic brands in many sectors have made huge progress on what I call the basic price value equation. They perform well and they are increasingly trusted where there is still a major gap, and which explains why Chinese brands have not penetrated Western markets, is on the more what we in marketing call the emotional side, the loyalty side, the side of saying that this is a part of my lifestyle and represents who I am as a person and defines my aspirations or my place in society or my own definition of identity. And there, Chinese brands have not made a lot of progress. But give credit where credit is due. Chinese marketers are extraordinarily pragmatic. They know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, which is why their distribution strategies are the way they are, why they are targeting the Middle East, why they are targeting Greater Asia, because those markets do require, given the lack of domestic alternatives there, the superiority of the Chinese price value equation. What you get for every dollar spent or renminbi spent. So I think that China is going to continue to play to its strengths, both domestically and abroad. And one other thing, China has scale. China knows scale more than any other company, any other country, and China knows how to mobilize resources on a national and international level, and that's something that no Western company can do. So it will continue to leverage that.
Yeah. And now we can take one last question from the audience. Anybody? If not, Seth?
Thank you all for coming to speak with us today. It really does mean a lot to hear from so many wise people. My question today is for you, Tom. So what is the greatest piece of advice that you can offer for an American like me or foreigners in general who are interested in pursuing business careers in China?
Well, you're not going to like what I have to hear. Now, I'm not talking about the future of Chinese business. We've already talked about that and whether it's going to be a good environment or not environment. I'm talking on a very personal level. On an individual level. And this is just my opinion, only my opinion. Go talk to many other people because there is no expert on how to pursue a career in China. There is no expert on Chinese culture. Everybody has different opinions. But I have always found it, helpful to, in the West, in America, I can't see whether you're from America or whether you're from China or whether you're an American Chinese, I can't see. But to get expertise, get your expert power, developed and honed, in your home market, so that when you go abroad, you are going in with a competitive advantage. Because the Chinese young folks are extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily hardworking. So you have to be thinking about what it is that I can develop, here that when I go into China is rather rare, so that you can come in with what I call expert power. and use that expert power to, integrate yourself in the Chinese business environment. If you're just going in with dreams of, having a cultural experience because you're thrilled with learning new things and interacting with, new people, you're not going to be bringing much to the party. And again, Chinese are very pragmatic. So make sure that you develop yourself before you go to China. Net.
Thank you.
Bravo.
All right, I guess we do have time for one last question from the audience. Is there anyone who want to add something? If not, we'll give Barry another chance.
It's really just the same question, but I also want to hear from Charles and Claire.
So would that be twisted a little bit for Chinese people who want to
Sure.
expand the business scope?
Claire?
What's the question again? About the pursuing business career in China, or I didn't get it, sorry.
It can be that, or it can be, say, Chinese young people who want to work in businesses in a multinational setting.
If you want to wait a bit, I'll go first.
Oh,
No, there's been a very, very strong effort by, I know, major cities in China, as well as Hong Kong, to attract talented people from all over the world to come and work. And in Hong Kong, for example, if you're 100 top university worldwide graduate, undergraduate, and Brown is one of them, obviously, you get very, very quick entry and residency permits, and even all kinds of support. In Beijing also, they're taking talents from all over the world. If you're willing to get a job and work in Beijing, especially in STEM, there are subsidies, including housing. So there are some benefits because of their just thirst for talented young people to come and work in China. But the competition, as Tom said, and I would say bravo, is very, very intense. Very, very intense. 2 years to 3 years of competition here is about to get you ready for any market in the world, I think. So, there are advantages and disadvantages to be in that environment. I think if you like to be steeled in battle, here's a good place for it.
If you are talking about working for a multinational company, not doing your own business, I think you can probably also consider AmCham, because we've got nearly 1,000 member companies who cover 40+ industries. So here you can get a chance to get to know a lot of companies, understanding their business models, understand their challenges, opportunities, and then after a couple of years, you can figure out where your passion is, which sector is the most promising sector, and then you can, grow from there. Be open-minded.
Thank you all for your insightful comments. We're at time. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, to discuss with you all in the past hour. I personally learned a lot. I've been taking notes. That's the end of our panel discussion today. And next we have in-person panel titled Switching Gears, China's Economic Outlook Amidst the Global Uncertainty from 10:15 to 11:30. So please stay tuned for it. And once again, I would like to express my gratitude to Claire, Charles, and Tom. Thank you all for speaking with us today. And yeah, hope you all have a nice rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.